Richard Dick Turpin was born at the Bluebell Inn, later the Rose and Crown, in Hampstead, Essex, the fifth of 6 children to John Turpin and Mary Elizabeth Parmenter. He was baptized on the 21st of September 1705 in the same parish where his parents had been married more than 10 years earlier. Turpin's father was a butcher and innkeeper. Several stories suggest that Dick Turpin may have followed his father into these trades. One hints that, as a teenager, he was apprenticed to a butcher in the village of Whitechapel, while another proposes that he ran his own butcher's shop in Thaxted. Testimony from his trial in 1739 suggests that he had a rudimentary education and, although no records survive of the date of the union, that in about 1725 he married Elizabeth Millington. Following his apprenticeship they moved north to Buckhurst Hill, Essex, where Turpin opened a butcher's shop. Turpin most likely became involved with the Essex gang of deer thieves in the early 1730s. Deer poaching had long been endemic in the Royal Forest of Waltham, and in 1723 the Black Act, so called because it outlawed the blackening or disguising of faces while in the forests, was enacted to deal with such problems. Deer stealing was a domestic offense that was judged not in civil courts but before justices of the peace. It was not until 1737 that the more severe penalty of 7 years transportation was introduced. However, in 1731 7 verderers became so concerned by the increase in activity that they signed an affidavit which demonstrated their worries. The statement was lodged with the Duke of Newcastle, Secretary of State, who responded by offering a £10 reward to anyone who helped identify the thieves, plus a pardon for those thieves who gave up their colleague. Following a series of nasty incidents, including the threatened murder of a keeper and his family, in 1733 the government increased the reward to £50, about £7,900 as of 2021. Essex Gang, sometimes called the Gregory Gang, which included Samuel Gregory, his brothers Jeremiah and Jasper, Joseph Rose, Mary Brazier, the gang's Ferns, John Jones, Thomas Rowden and a young John Wheeler, who needed contacts to help them to dispose of the deer. Turpin, a young butcher who traded in the area, almost certainly became involved with their activities. By 1733 the changing fortunes of the gang may have prompted him to leave the butchery trade, and he became the landlord of a public house, most likely the Rose and Crown at Clay Hill, although there is no evidence to suggest that Turpin was directly involved in the thefts. By summer 1734 he was a close associate of the gang, which may indicate that he had been known to them for some time. By October 1734 several in the gang had either been captured or had fled, and the remaining members moved away from poaching, raiding the home of a chandler and grocer named Peter Spolett, at Woodford. Although the identities of the perpetrators are unknown, Turpin may have been involved. 2 nights later they struck again, at the Woodford home of a gentleman named Richard Woolridge, a furnisher of small arms in the Office of Ordnance at the Tower of London. In December Jasper and Samuel Gregory, John Jones, and John Wheeler, attacked the home of John Gladwin, a higgler, and John Shockley, in Chingford. On the 19th of December Turpin and 5 other men raided the home of Ambrose Skinner, a 73-year-old farmer from Barking, leaving with an estimated £300. 2 days later, the gang minus Turpin attacked the home of a keeper, William Mason, at Epping Forest. During the robbery Mason's servant managed to escape, and returned about an hour later with several neighbors, by which time the house was ransacked and the thieves long gone. On the 11th of January 1735 the gang raided the Charlton home of a Mr. Saunders, for the robbery of a gentleman named Sheldon. 1 week later at Croydon, Turpin arrived masked and armed with pistols, with 4 other members of the gang. In the same month 2 men, possibly from the same gang, raided the home of a Reverend Mr. Dyde. The clergyman was absent but the 2 cut his manservant around the face in a barbarous manner. Another brutal attack occurred on 1st of February 1735 at Lawton. The gang lived in or around London. For a time Turpin stayed at Whitechapel, before moving to Millbank. On 4th of February 1735 he met John Fielder, Samuel Gregory, Joseph Rose, and John Wheeler, at an inn along the Broadway in London. They planned to rob the house of Joseph Lawrence, a farmer at Ilsbury Farm in Edgware. Late that afternoon, after stopping twice along the way for food and drink, they captured a shepherd boy and burst into the house, armed with pistols. They bound the two maidservants and brutally attacked the 70-year-old farmer. They pulled his breeches around his ankles and dragged him around the house, but Lawrence refused to reveal the whereabouts of his money. Turpin beat Lawrence's bare buttocks with his pistols, badly bruising him, and other members of the gang beat him around the head with their pistols. They emptied a kettle of water over his head, forced him to sit bare buttocked on the fire, and pulled him around the house by his nose and hair. Gregory took one of the maidservants upstairs and raped her. For their trouble, the gang escaped with a haul of less than 30 pounds. 3 days later, Turpin, accompanied by the same men along with William Saunders and Humphrey Walker, brutally raided a farm in Marylebone. The attack netted the gang just under 90 pounds. The next day, the Duke of Newcastle offered a reward of 50 pounds in exchange for information leading to the conviction of the several persons involved in the two Woodford robberies, and the robberies of the widow Shelley and Reverend Died. On the 11th of February, Fielder, Saunders, and Wheeler were apprehended. Two accounts of their capture exist. One claims that on their way to rob the Lawrence household, the gang had stopped at an alehouse in Edgware, and that on the 11th of February, while out walking, the owner noticed a group of horses outside an alehouse in Bloomsbury. He recognized these horses as those used by the same group of men who had stopped at his alehouse before the Lawrence attack, and called for the parish constable. Another account claims that two of the gang were spotted by a servant of Joseph Lawrence. Regardless, the three, who were drinking with a woman, possibly Mary Brazier, were promptly arrested and committed to prison. Wheeler, who may have been as young as 15, quickly betrayed his colleagues, and descriptions of those yet to be captured were circulated in the press. In the London Gazette, Turpin was described as Richard Turpin, a butcher by trade, is a tall, fresh-colored man, very much marked with the smallpox, about 26 years of age, about 5 feet 9 inches high, lived some time ago in Whitechapel and did lately lodge somewhere about Millbank, Westminster, wears a blue-grey coat and a natural wig. Once Wheeler's confession became apparent, the other members of the gang fled their usual haunts. Turpin informed Gregory and the others of Wheeler's capture, and left Westminster on 15th of February 1735. While Wheeler was busy confessing to the authorities, 3 or 4 men, most likely Samuel Gregory, Herbert Haynes, Turpin, and possibly Thomas Rowden, robbed the house of a Mrs. St. John at Chingford. On the following day, Turpin and Rowden, if present, parted company with Gregory and Haynes, and headed for Hempstead to see his family. Gregory and Haynes may have gone looking for Turpin, because on 17th of February they stopped at an alehouse in Debden and ordered a shoulder of mutton, intending to stay for the night. However, a man named Palmer recognized them, and called for the parish constable. A fracas ensued, during which the two thieves escaped. They rejoined Turpin, and along with Jones and Rowden may have traveled to Gravesend NBBL before returning to Woodford. Another robbery was reported at Woodford toward the end of February, possibly by Gregory and his cohorts, but with most avenues of escape cut off, and with the authorities hunting them down. The remaining members of the Essex gang kept their heads down and remained undercover, probably in Epping Forest. Six days after the arrest of Fielder, Saunders, and Wheeler, just as Turpin and his associates were returning from Gravesend, Rose, Brazier, and Walker were captured at a chandler's shop in Westminster, while drinking punch. Fielder, Rose, Saunders and Walker were tried at the Middlesex General Session between the 26th of February and the 1st of March 1735. Turpin and Gregory were also named on the indictments for burglary. Walker died while still in Newgate Prison, but the remaining 3 were hanged at Tyburn Gallows on the 10th of March, before their bodies were hung to rot on gibbets on Edgware Road. Walker's body was hung in chains. 2 days before the hanging, a report of 4 suspicious men being driven away from an alehouse at East Sheen appeared in a newspaper, and was likely describing Gregory and his companions. but the remaining members of the Essex gang were not reported again until the 30th of March, when 3 of them unsuccessfully tried to steal a horse from a servant of the Earl of Suffolk. Turpin was present with 4 of the gang at another robbery, reported on the 8th of March. Jasper Gregory meanwhile was captured, and then executed late in March. His brothers were arrested on the 9th of April in Rake, West Sussex, after a struggle during which Samuel lost the tip of his nose to a sword, and Jeremy was shot in the leg. He died in Winchester Gaol. Samuel was tried in May, and executed on the 4th of June. His body was later moved to hang in chains alongside those of his colleagues at Edgware. Mary Brazier was transported to the 13 colonies. Herbert Haynes was captured on the 13th of April, and executed in August. John Wheeler, who had been instrumental in proving the cases against his former colleagues, and who was freed, died at Hackney in January 1738. The reason for his death is not recorded, but is assumed to be natural causes. With the Essex gang now smashed by the authorities, Turpin turned instead to the crime he became most noted for: highway robbery. Although he may have been involved in earlier, he was first identified as a suspect in one event highway robberies on the 10th and 12th of April. On 10th of July, as Turpin the Butcher, along with Thomas Rowden, the Pewterer. Several days later the two struck at Epping Forest, depriving a man from Southwark of his belongings. With a further bounty of £100 on their heads, they continued their activities through the latter half of 1735. In August they robbed 5 people accompanying a coach on Barnes Common, and shortly after that they attacked another coach party between Putney and Kingston Hill. On the 20th of August the pair relieved a Mr. Godfrey of 6 guineas and a pocketbook on Hounslow Heath. Fearing capture, they moved on to Blackheath in Hertfordshire, and then back to London. On the 5th of December the two were seen near Winchester, but in late December, following the capture of John Jones, they separated. Rowden had previously been convicted of counterfeiting, and in July 1736, he was convicted of passing counterfeit coin under the alias Daniel Crisp. Crisp's true name was eventually discovered and he was transported in June 1738. Jones also suffered transportation to the 13 colonies. Little is known of Turpin's movements during 1736. He may have traveled to Holland, as various sightings were reported there, but he may also have assumed an alias and disappeared from public view. In February 1737 though, he spent the night at Puckeridge, with his wife, her maid and a man called Robert Knott. Turpin arranged the meeting by letter, which was intercepted by the authorities, while Turpin eluded his enemies, making his escape to Cambridge. The others were arrested on charges of violent suspicion of being dangerous rogues and robbing upon the highway. They were imprisoned at Hertford Gaol, although the women were later acquitted. Knott was released at the next assize, although one report late in March suggests, unusually, that Turpin alone robbed a company of higglers. In the same month he was reported to be working alongside 2 other highwaymen, Matthew King, then, and since, incorrectly identified as Tom King, and Stephen Potter. The group were responsible for a string of robberies between March and April 1737 which ended suddenly in an incident at Whitechapel, after King, or Turpin, depending upon which report is read, had stolen a horse near Waltham Forest. Its owner, Joseph Major, reported the theft to Richard Bayes, landlord of the Green Man public house at Leytonstone. Bayes, who later wrote a biography of Turpin, tracked the horse to the Red Lion at Whitechapel. Major identified the animal, but as it was late evening and the horses had not yet been collected by their owners, they elected to hold a vigil. John King, Matthew King's brother, arrived late that night, and was quickly apprehended by the party, which included the local constable. John King told him the whereabouts of Matthew King, who was waiting nearby. During the resulting melee, Matthew King was wounded by gunfire, 46, and died on the 19th of May. Potter was later caught, but at his trial was released for lack of evidence against him. Bayes' statement regarding the death of Matthew King may have been heavily embellished. Several reports including Turpin's own account. LB offered different versions of what actually happened on that night early in May 1737. Early reports claimed that Turpin had shot King. However, by the following month the same newspapers retracted this claim, and stated that Bayes had fired the fatal shot. The shooting of King, however, preceded an event that changed Turpin's life significantly. He escaped to a hideaway in Epping Forest, where he was seen by Thomas Morris, a servant of one of the forest's keepers. Turpin shot and killed Morris on the 4th of May with a carbine when, armed with pistols, Morris attempted to capture him. The shooting was reported in the Gentleman's Magazine, it having been represented to the King that Richard Turpin did on Wednesday the 4th of May last barbarously murder Thomas Morris, servant to Henry Thompson, one of the keepers of Epping Forest, and commit other notorious felonies and robberies near London. His Majesty is pleased to promise his most gracious pardon to any of his accomplices, and a reward of £200 to any person or persons that shall discover him, so as he may be apprehended and convicted. Turpin was born at Thaxted in Essex, is about 30, by trade a butcher, about 5 feet 9 inches high, brown complexion, very much marked with the smallpox, his cheekbones broad, his face thinner towards the bottom, his visage short, pretty upright, and broad about the shoulders. The Gentleman's Magazine, dated June 1737. Several newspapers suggested that on the 6th and 7th of May, he committed 2 highway robberies near Epping. Turpin may also have lost his mount. On the 7th of May, Elizabeth King, the wee of Turpin's accomplice, attempted to secure 2 horses left by Matthew King, at an inn called the Red Lion. The horses were suspected as belonging to highwaymen and Elizabeth King was arrested for questioning, but she was later released without charge. Morris's killing unleashed a flood of Turpin reports, and a reward of £200 was offered for his capture. Sometime around June 1737, Turpin boarded at the Ferry Inn at Brough, under the alias of John Palmer, or Parman. Traveling across the River Humber, between the historic counties of the East Riding of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, he posed as a horse trader, and often hunted alongside local gentlemen. On the 2nd of October 1738 Turpin shot another man's gamecock in the street, while being rebuked by John Robinson. He then threatened to shoot him also. 3 East Riding justices, JPs, George Crowell, Member of Parliament for Hull, Hugh Bethel, and Marmaduke Constable, travelled to Brough and took written depositions about the incident. They threatened to bind him over, but Turpin refused to pay the required surety, and was committed to the House of Correction at Beverley. Turpin was escorted to Beverley by the parish constable, Kerry Gill. He made no attempt at escape. It has been suggested that Turpin may have been depressed about failures in his life. Robert Appleton, clerk of the peace for the East Riding, and the man whose account details the above incident, later reported that the 3 JPs made enquiries as to how Palmer had made his money, suspecting that his lifestyle was funded by criminal activities. Turpin claimed that he was a butcher who had fallen into debt, and that he had levanted from his home in Long Sutton, Lincolnshire. When contacted, the JP at Long Sutton, a Mr. Delamere, confirmed that John Palmer had lived there for about 9 months, but that he was suspected of stealing sheep, and had escaped the custody of the local constable. Delamere also suspected that Palmer was a horse thief and had taken several depositions supporting his view, and told the 3 JPs that he would prefer him to be detained. The 3 JPs now presumed that the case was too serious for Palmer to remain at Beverley House of Correction, and demanded sureties for his appearance at York Assizes. Turpin refused, and so on the 16th of October he was transferred to York Castle in handcuffs. Horse theft became a capital offence in 1545, punishable by death. During the 17th and 18th centuries, crimes in violation of property rights were some of the most severely punished. Most of the 200 capital statutes were property offences. Robbery combined with violence was the sort of offence, second only to premeditated murder, a relatively uncommon crime, most likely to be prosecuted and punished to the law's utmost rigor. Turpin had stolen several horses while operating under the pseudonym of Palmer. In July 1737 he stole a horse from Pinchbeck in Lincolnshire, and took it to visit his Father at Hempstead. When Turpin returned to Bruff stealing 3 horses along the way, he left the gelding with his father. The identity of John Turpin's son was well known, and the horse's identity was soon discovered. On the 12th of September 1738 therefore, John Turpin was committed to gaol in Essex on charges of horse theft, but following his help in preventing a gaol break, the charges were dropped on 5th of March 1739. About a month after Palmer had been moved to York Castle, Thomas Creasy, the owner of the 3 horses stolen by Turpin, managed to track them down and recover them, and it was for these thefts that he was eventually tried. From his cell, Turpin wrote to his brother-in-law, Pompey Ravernal, who also lived at Hempstead. Ravernal was married to Turpin's sister, Dorothy. The letter was kept at the local post office, but seeing the York Post stamp, Ravernal refused to pay the delivery charge, claiming that he had no correspondent at York. Ravernal may not have wanted to pay the charge for the letter, or he may have wished to distance himself from Turpin's affairs, and so the letter was moved to the post office at Saffron Walden, where James Smith, who had taught his younger schoolmate Turpin how to write while they were at school, recognized the handwriting. He alerted J.P. Thomas Stubbing, who paid the postage and opened the letter. Smith traveled to York Castle and on the 23rd of February identified Palmer as Turpin. He received the £200, about $32,000 as of 2019, reward originally offered by the Duke of Newcastle following Turpin's murder of Thomas Morris. Although there was some question as to where the trial should be held, the Duke of Newcastle wanted him tried in London. Turpin was tried at York Assizes. Proceedings began 3 days after the Winter Assizes opened. On 22nd of March, Turpin was charged with the theft of Creasy's horses, a mare worth £3, a foal worth 20 shillings, and a gelding worth £3. The indictment stated that the alleged offences had occurred at Welton on 1st of March 1739 and described Turpin as John Palmer alias Palmer alias Richard Turpin, late of the Castle of York in the County of York, labourer. Technically the charges were invalid. The offences had occurred at Hickington, not Welton, and the date was also incorrect. The offences were in August 1738. Presiding over the trial was Sir William Chappell, a senior and respected judge in his early 60s. The prosecution was directed by King's Counsel Thomas Place and Richard Crowell, brother of George, and proceedings were recorded by a York resident, Thomas Kyle. Turpin had no defense barrister. During this period of English history, those accused had no right to legal representation, and their interests were cared for by the presiding judge. Among the 7 witnesses called to testify were Thomas Creasy and James Smith, the man who had recognized Turpin's handwriting. Turpin offered little in the way of questioning his accusers. When asked if he had anything to ask of Creasy, he replied, "I cannot say anything, for I have not any witnesses come this day, as I have expected, and therefore beg of your lordship to put off my trial till another day." And when asked about Smith, he claimed not to know him. When questioned himself, Turpin told the court that he had bought the mare and foal from an innkeeper near Hickington. He repeated his original story of how he had come to use the pseudonym Palmer, claiming that it was his mother's maiden name. When asked by the judge for his name before he came to Lincolnshire, he said Turpin. Without leaving the courtroom, the jury found Turpin guilty of the first charge of stealing the mare and foal, and following further proceedings, guilty of stealing the gelding. Throughout the trial, Turpin had repeatedly claimed that he had not been allowed enough time to form his defense, that proceedings should be delayed until he could call his witnesses, and that the trial should be held at Essex. Before sentencing him, the judge asked Turpin if he could offer any reason why he should not be sentenced to death. Turpin said, "It is very hard upon me, my lord, because I was not prepared for my defense." The judge replied, "Why was you not? You knew the time of the assizes as well as any person here." Despite Turpin's pleas that he had been told the trial would be held in Essex, the judge replied, "Whoever told you so were highly to blame, and as your country have found you guilty of a crime worthy of death, it is my office to pronounce sentence against you, sentencing him to death." Before his execution, Turpin frequently received visitors. The jailer was reputed to have earned £100 from selling drinks to Turpin and his guests, although he refused the efforts of a local clergyman who offered him serious remonstrances and admonitions. John Turpin may have sent his son a letter dated 29th of March, urging him to beg of God to pardon your many transgressions, which the thief upon the cross received pardon for at the last hour. Turpin bought a new frock coat and shoes, and on the day before his execution and hired 5 mourners for £3.10, to be shared between them. On the 7th of April 1739, followed by his mourners, Turpin and John Stead, a horse thief, were taken through York by open cart to Knavesmire, which was then the city's equivalent of London's Tyburn gallows. Turpin behaved himself with amazing assurance, and bowed to the spectators as he passed. He climbed a ladder to the gallows and spoke to his executioner. York had no permanent hangman, and it was the custom to pardon the prisoner on condition that he acted as executioner. On this occasion, the pardoned man was a fellow highwayman, Thomas Hadfield. An account in the Gentleman's Magazine for 7th of April 1739 notes Turpin's brashness. Turpin behaved in an undaunted manner. As he mounted the ladder, feeling his right leg tremble, he spoke a few words to the topsman, then threw himself off, and expired in 5 minutes. The short drop method of hanging meant that those executed were killed by slow strangulation, and so Turpin was left hanging until late afternoon, before being cut down and taken to a tavern in Castlegate. The next morning, Turpin's body was buried in the graveyard of St. George's Church, Fishergate.